Welcome to Common Sense Unfiltered, where we talk common sense. Because as it turns out, it's not all that common.
I'm Katie Ratliff, Executive Director of Common Sense Institute, Arizona.
And I'm Cinamon Watson, National CEO of Common Sense Institute.
Across the country, policymakers are making big decisions on complex issues that are often filtered through politics and partisanship. That's where CSI comes in.
We're nonpartisan, nonprofit, and focused on the facts. And each episode, we bring in the experts behind the research to break down complex issues and what they actually mean for your business, household, and family.
This is Common Sense Unfiltered, where common sense still exists, even when it's hard to find. Welcome to Common Sense Unfiltered, where we skip the spin and dive straight into the data. I'm Cinamon Watson, CEO of Common Sense Institute, and this November, Colorado voters are facing one of the most consequential ballots in Colorado history. We're looking at a number of fiscal issues, two of which we'll dive in today, that really impact our tax policy. We're lucky enough to be joined by Ross Kaminsky. Ross has a very long and accomplished resume, but for Common Sense Institute, we're so pleased to have him here as our Leprino Free Enterprise Fellow. Ross, tell us a little bit about yourself and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I am, very proud to be the Lori Leprino Free Enterprise Fellow. I prize my association with the Common Sense Institute because CSI is nonpartisan and data-driven and all about just getting information out to folks. As for me, I studied foreign policy and economics at Columbia University, and then I was the youngest trader on the trading floor at the Chicago Board Options Exchange in Chicago. I traded there. I traded across the street at the Board of Trade. I traded in Europe for a while. Then I met a girl in Australia, married her, moved to Colorado. Trading was no longer in pits and no longer fun, and I won't bore you with the long version of the story, but I made my way into radio. And so now I am the 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. host on KOA, which is 850 a.m. and 94.1 FM, the biggest talk station in Denver, maybe the biggest talk station in the Rocky Mountains. And I absolutely love my job. And so, I get to do two things I love, be on the radio and be a CSI fellow.
That's fantastic. I honestly didn't know you traded in Europe. Where did you trade?
I traded, so I was living in Amsterdam, but I was trading the German market, which was already computerized at the time. I wish I had traded the Dutch market. The German market was on a screen, and the Dutch market was in trading pits, and the rules had been set up by the staff from the Chicago Exchange. So I knew all the rules, and I could have really just killed it in the trading pits in Amsterdam. But the firm I went over there for wanted to get into electronic trading, so I was trading the German market.
Got it. Well, let's jump to the Colorado ballot. Today, we're looking at two measures. They're a little bit competing. One is a progressive tax increase, and one is a cap on the income tax. And in many people's minds, these are dueling tax increases. But why are these landing on the ballot all at once?
So we've got a lot going on with spending and taxation. In addition to the two you mentioned that we'll talk about, we have Proposition NN as well.
Correct.
And that's also so to directly answer your question, why are they landing all at once? We see a fairly typical pattern in this state. It's not always the same, but it's common. And that is that the political left, and not to make this a partisan thing, but it's just a fact, the Democrats tend to want to spend more money. They do not like the Taxpayer Bill of Rights restraining the amount of money that government can keep from taxpayers. And so they propose either laws or ballot measures in this case that will allow them to take more money from taxpayers, and then conservative organizations respond with ballot measures of their own to try to either completely blunt or at least somewhat lessen the effect of the tax increases coming from the political left.
Great. Well, let's start with Proposition NN, since you mentioned that, and that was passed by the legislature and referred to the ballot in the form of Senate Bill 135. In plain English, what does that measure actually do?
So Proposition NN is a tricky one. And before we get into what it'll do, let me just say, it really bothers me when politicians create titles or narratives around bills that are misleading about what they will do. So when this thing ends up on the ballot, it's going to be, and I don't have the title in front of me at the moment, but that it is going to say something about raising money for education. And basically what it does is it will change the tabor limits so that the government can take in a lot more money, and they claim that the money will go to K through 12 education. But actually, in the long run, it appears likely that maybe a quarter of it will go to education and the rest will go to the government's general fund for politicians to spend on whatever they want to spend it on. And effectively, what this would do is, based on our modeling here at Common Sense Institute, is it will likely eliminate any tabor refund going forward. And if it had been in place in 2022 and 2023 and 24, but 22 and 23, there were very big tabor refunds, it would have eliminated all of those. So this is basically about eliminating your tabor refund and pretending it's about education.
I think CSI's latest ballot analysis found that $850.9 million would be the total of lost tabor refunds through fiscal year 28. What does that mean for the average? What's that mean to the average Colorado household in terms of numbers?
So yes, I'm looking at the same numbers you're looking at. So roughly 330 million not refunded to taxpayers in 2027 and 521 million in 2028. And there are a lot of different potential impacts here, right? So the obvious one is the loss of the tabor refunds. And in most years, your tabor refund is an approximate function of how much you paid in income taxes. It's in buckets, so you don't just take your income tax and multiply it by something. But if you're in this range of income, you get this much back. Another range of income, you get this much back. So for individuals who earn $50,000 a year, according to CSI's research, they would lose about $60. Earning $100,000 a year, you'd lose a little less than $100. Earning $500,000 a year, you'd lose $341. Now, those don't sound like much, but if it's one thing after another, and we will get into it with one of the other ballot measures, but it's this kind of a economic, water torture, just one thing after another, making this place less friendly for individual taxpayers and businesses. And when you start raising taxes, and again, we'll get into it more in one of the ballot measures, you are likely to have secondary effects that are much more important, actually, than the direct thing. You might say if somebody making $100,000 loses $96, who cares? But what's likely to happen from NN because of the additional tax burden is that we will likely lose jobs in the state. The modeling has a wide range of somewhere around 50 jobs up to over 2,200 jobs that might be lost. And between 12 million and 120 million, again, I realize that range is enormous, but it depends on a lot of assumptions, but 12 to 120 million of lost GDP, and it goes on from there. Hugely negative impacts on personal income overall, because when you start aggregating $60 and $96 and $341 over every Colorado taxpayer, you are talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 and something $1 million loss of personal income.
Stunning. Just stunning. Well, you touched on one of the questions that I'm asking about all of the Colorado ballot initiatives this year. Will this make Colorado more or less competitive?
So we've had a slow, steady, consistent decline in the competitiveness of Colorado. And the Common Sense Institute has written many reports that either address competitiveness directly or indirectly, right? So directly, all right, we're going to talk about competitiveness, and here we are on these competitiveness scales. But then also all these other things that are indirect. Where are we on business taxes? Where are we on regulation? Where are all these things? And for some years now, especially since we have had one-party control of state government, and again, not to make this partisan, it's just an observation and it's just a fact, Democrats control everything in this state. There is not one statewide elected Republican. I don't mean there's no Republican in office. I mean, there is no Republican in Colorado that has been elected to an office that every person in Colorado votes on. So governor, secretary of state, state treasurer, attorney general, CU regent at large, a federal senator. None of those are Republicans. So you've got one party control, and they have a way that they think about things. And the way they think about things is they tend to prioritize government revenue to fund whatever the projects are that they find worthy over competitiveness. And we are seeing that in the data, a slow, steady erosion of Colorado's competitiveness. And this would make it much, much worse. I will add one other thing that I just want to throw in. So yesterday, as I'm speaking to you now, it's August 13th. I'm not sure what day this will be released, but yesterday we interviewed Phil Weiser on my radio show, and Phil is certainly a Democrat and a liberal, but he has expressed concern to me privately and publicly about Colorado's business competitiveness. And to hear that from the guy who's going to be our next governor, I'm not going to say it gives me lots of hope. He still does share the economic viewpoints of many of those folks, but it gives me a little hope that at least he's saying he's aware of the problem.
That's great. Well, let's move on to initiatives 195 and 232, the two we mentioned earlier. Again, looking at Colorado's tax rates, one's a cap, one is not. One dramatically changes the flat tax that has been in place in Colorado since the early 90s. Tell me what you found on that and a little bit about the ballot analysis.
Okay, so these are competing ballot measures like we talked about at the very beginning of the show, where sometimes you will have people who want to raise taxes or attack Tabor, propose something, and then conservative organizations, in this case, Advance Colorado, bring a competing ballot measure designed to stop it or offset it. So the left came first with Initiative 195. And what that does is it would change as you already said, Cinamon, the flat tax that we have here in Colorado, which is 4.4% on everybody. Although when you start looking at deductions and exclusions and things like that, the effective tax rate can change a little bit. So if you are a lower income Coloradan, you will pay a somewhat lower effective tax rate than or maybe more than somewhat than 4.4%. And as you start going up in income, you start approaching that actual 4.4% number more. So there is a little bit of what they call progressivity in the tax code. Let me just interject one other thing before I get to the changes from 195. I should stop using the term progressive when it comes to tax codes or anything else. There is very little that's actually progressive about the progressive movement, about restricting speech, which progressives want to do, about taxing people more, which progressives want to do. It's really kind of all regressive, right? Hundreds of years ago, the king would tax people more. The king would tell people what you cannot say. And I really don't like the term progressive. And it is an excellent representation of how one side of the political aisle has done a much better job controlling and manipulating the language of politics than the other side has. The word progressive is actually a brilliant but misleading term about things they want to do. So that's one interjection. Now, to get directly to your question. So right now it's 4.4% for everybody. If Proposition 195 were to pass, and there's a little asterisk there because if it passes, but the other ballot measure passes as well, then we'll talk about that. But as a standalone, what this would do would be slightly lower the income tax rate for people making less than $100,000 or less. So up to $25,000, it would drop to 3.7%. But people are only earning up to $25,000 are in fact paying much, much, much less than that anyway, because so much of their income is excluded from being taxed. Then from 25 to 100,000, it would be 4.2%. From 100 to 500, it would be 4.4%, which is the current rate. Now here's where it starts getting punitive, which is a better word than progressive for what they like to do with taxes. From $500,000 to $750,000 in adjusted gross income, your tax rate would jump to 7.4%. Then for the next $250,000, it jumps to 7.9%. And then above $1 million in income, it jumps to 8.4%. So this is really all about punishing success.
And I think, Ross, too, I'll go off topic for just a second. On top of that tax code, I believe we looked at fees earlier this year, and you had a hand in looking at some of that. So this is in addition to the overall, what was that, a 3,000% increase in fees?
Yes, the percentage increase in fees is some enormous number like that. And another nice way to think about it, well, it's not nice if you're a taxpayer, but if we funded the stuff that government is doing out of taxes instead of out of taxes that we call fees, so that Democrats can get around Tabor, because a tax you would have to bring to the voters, and they don't like doing that. Even if you exclude the costs of higher education, if you counted the fees as taxes, our effective tax rate is more like 8% rather than 4.4%. So you might think of us as a low tax state, but when you include the fees, we're really not a low tax state. We're a fairly high tax state already. And if Initiative 195 were to pass, then if you had the misfortune to be above $500,000 in income, you would be severely punished. And you are talking about, at that point, effective tax rates over 10%, maybe more like 12%.
And if, at the same time, we have this competing measure, the tax cap, which I think is measure 232. And all of these measures will have different numbers and letters and be recognized a bit differently on the ballot when it comes around.
Yeah.
But what does 232 do? What would be the impact of that one?
And before I answer that, let me just say one other thing on 195, that where there's a parallel to what we were talking about with Proposition NN, except this would be much worse. The incentive for high income earners to leave this state, and they tend to be people who start companies or own companies or create jobs. The incentive for them to leave the state, if Initiative 195 were to pass, is going to be enormous. And so while our research at Common Sense Institute does suggest that at least up front, it would raise modestly more money for the government. In other words, it would take more money from taxpayers. In the longer run, this measure, like NN, but probably more so, would do, we think, real measurable harm to the Colorado economy, and using a word that you brought up before, Cinamon, dramatically harm Colorado's competitiveness. So I just wanted to get that in. So talking about 232. So Initiative 232 would be a statutory change that would cap Colorado's income tax rate at 4.4%. So it's important to note that this is not a constitutional measure. It's a law. It would be a statutory change, which means it only needs 50% plus one to pass. It also means that eventually it could be overridden with another statutory measure that would only need 50.1% to pass. There's also an interesting tidbit regarding 195, because what 195 would do would be delete the language from the state constitution about a flat tax. But when we passed the ballot measure some years ago that requires a 55% margin to amend the state constitution, it included a carve-out for a ballot measure that only deletes language and does not add language to the state constitution. And that's how the tax hike in 195 was structured. So even though 195 does modify the state constitution, since it's only deleting language within the Constitution and then the rest is statutory, it also only needs 50.1% to pass. I know I'm a little in the weeds here, Cinamon. I hope you don't mind.
No.
One other thing that I'll mention that I think is quite fascinating. Since 232 is statutory only, 195, as I said, constitutional and statutory, the signature requirements are different. And as you and I are recording this today, we do not know whether either or both of these has made the ballot. I do think that 232 is very likely to make the ballot because the supporters of 232, which caps the income tax rate at 4.4%, have turned in way more signatures than necessary. And it's likely that after the Secretary of State goes through and estimates what percentage of those are valid signatures and all that, it's very likely to make the ballot. Because it's statutory only, their requirement was just some number of signatures in the state. I think it was around 150,000. I could be wrong about that. Initiative 195, because it is partially constitutional, they have a different requirement that not only is they need to get to some number of signatures, but they also need, and again, I may have this number wrong, but I think it's 2%. They need signatures of 2% of the number of voters, registered voters, in each individual state Senate district. And that is not always an easy thing to do. And especially if they are going to bring a measure to raise taxes, and they've got to try to get some significant number of signatures in some rural red districts or El Paso County, that kind of thing. I'm not saying they won't do it, but it's definitely harder to do as far as meeting the signature requirement than the 4.4% cap is. Does that make sense, Cinamon?
It does. It does. Great observation there. I did want to mention CSI hosted a Pints and Policy event earlier this week where we discussed these measures. And County Commissioner Steve O'Dorisio from Adams County had some unique observations. And his thought was that a lot of these measures are coming about because of questions of affordability, that young people in particular are frustrated about not being able to afford a home, the high cost of living, all of those sorts of things, and looking at perhaps, as you said, the regressive tax increase instead of a progressive tax increase. But Initiative 195 may be sort of a result of that angst and concern. And so his advice was to respond not with, no, this is terrible, it's going to kill jobs, or yes, this is good, or what have you, but what is another policy solution? What are people hungry for? A more affordable Colorado, and how do we achieve that?
So, I mean, I think he's right. I think the data says what the data says, and we can go as far with that as we can. Our side, the data-oriented side, let's say, we focus on these things, and CSI understands these things. But a lot of voters, and especially younger voters, who will tend to be the ones who support this most regressive stuff, they are more influenced by stories than by data, and it's not easy necessarily to reach them with this kind of stuff. But in a sense, I still think, I don't know if it's the best argument, but I still think a strong argument for those people is, don't you have an ambition to be successful yourself? And if you were planning on starting a business or or investing or doing something where you thought you might do quite well, are you going to stay? Would you even start in a state that tells you right up front, if you do well, we're going to punish you? And if you think you wouldn't stay, then should you support this? And if you wouldn't stay, what does it mean for the people who want to start a business? You want to go start a business making widgets, or you want to go start a business walking dogs, or you want any business at all, and you expect to be pretty successful, and you want to end up employing 50 people in this state, or 500 or 5,000 people in this state. And we are passing measures saying, if you are that successful and you actually end up doing so well that you employ 500 people in this state, then we are going to tax you twice as much as we tax somebody else who is less successful. Are you going to want to start that business in that state? And then next step, Maybe you're not that entrepreneurial person who's going to start the business. Maybe you're somebody who would love to work for that person. Maybe you would love to work as a dog walker or making widgets or whatever other thing this business is going to do. Now that job is going to simply be gone. Now you are going to lose opportunity after opportunity after opportunity when the entrepreneurs say, sorry, I'm taking my business somewhere else. So we got to kind of combine the data and the stories. And let me mention one other thing that you've kind of touched on, and I didn't get to. If Proposition 232, which would be a 4.4% cap, passes, and 195, which would create a much higher rate, also passes, we get a really interesting situation. So you want me to go into that a little bit?
Sure.
So we have a strange law in this state that says if there are multiple ballot measures that compete with each other in terms of policy outcome, and they are on the ballot at the same time, in the same year, then whichever one gets the most votes is the one that has the dominant effect where they compete. And so in this case, 232 would cap rates at 4.4%. 195 would add 3 new rates above 4.4% at 7.4, 7.9, and 8.4. So if they both pass, but 195, the tax hike, gets more votes, then all of their new tax brackets would come into force. If they both pass, but 232 gets more votes, then those higher tax brackets would not be allowed to come into force. And those ones that would be 7.4, 7.9, and 8.4 would all be capped at 4.4. One of the interesting legal questions is what happens with the lower tax rate. So 195, and the people behind 195 are very clever. They're trying to get people to vote for a massive, massive tax hike by showing people who are making up to $100,000 that they'll actually have a small tax cut. And they're trying to get lots of people to vote for it by looking at their small tax cut. Now, I think the most common view is that if they both pass, then the tax cuts for the lower income folks in 195 will still come into force. That is probably true, but not necessarily true. And you may end up seeing a lawsuit if they both pass, but 232 has more votes. You may end up seeing a lawsuit saying all of the 195 tax brackets are part of one package of tax brackets. And if any part of that package of tax brackets is disallowed, any part of 195's tax brackets is disallowed because of 232 passing, then none of its brackets are allowed to come into force. So you may eventually see a challenge if 232 passes. If they both pass, but 232 has more votes, you may see a challenge saying that the lower tax brackets for people earning $100,000 or less, and there's 2 new tax brackets there, they might be invalid, and we might end up right where we are now at 4.4% for everybody.
So pretty much voting for these is going to end us in court.
I think so. I think
legal
so.
challenge.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
Ross,
and there's also another potentially interesting question, Cinnamon. What if 232 passes, capping everything at 4.4%, and then and 195 either doesn't pass or doesn't even make the ballot if they don't get the signatures, but then they run it again in the future? Then what happens? Well, then they'll have to pass something that says we are overturning 232 and then doing this other thing. It's a mess. It's really a mess. But one thing we know for sure is that the people who want more money always want more money. And if these pass, if NN passes, if 195 passes, no matter how much of your money they take with this stuff, I guarantee you they will come back for more later.
Well, Ross, we appreciate the work that you're doing at CSI so much on these ballot analysis. And we also appreciate you being here today. your fellowship has just been such a gift to CSI. So thank you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today. We will link all of these studies to this podcast. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to CSI and check out our website for more, the latest events, news, and research. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Cinnamon.